Hello, I'm Florian Henry, a proud alumna of the college and executive director of UChicago Alumni. I'd like to thank all of you for joining the nearly 5,000 members of the community who signed up to join us today. This turnout is remarkable and such a testament to each of you, to our remarkable community of alumni, friends, and parents, and to all of your thirst for continuing to live the life of the mind. As I imagine that most of you do not have the joy of experiencing all that is happening at the university on a daily basis like I do want to take just a moment to share some of the exciting things happening at the university. So far this academic year, we've celebrated the university's 100th and 101st Nobel Prizes awarded to James Robinson, the Institute Director of the Pearson Institute, and the Reverend Dr. Richard L. Pearson, Professor of Global Conflict Studies, for his research on how institutions are formed and affect prosperity, and to 2017 alum John Jumper for developing an AI model that predicts the complex folded structures of proteins. We've also launched the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Growth, a groundbreaking institute that will balance the risks of a changing climate with the need for human progress. We've celebrated the 10th anniversary of the Chicago Principles, the guidelines that define how we practice our foundational commitment to free expression and academic freedom. We've honored the 100th anniversary of the Institute for the Study of Ancient Culture Chicago House in Luxor, Egypt, where the epigraphic survey has operated continuously for a century. And we've opened the new John W. Boyer Center in Paris, which will serve as a regional hub for the university's research in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, and build upon the incredibly successful study abroad opportunities available to our students. And finally, we've celebrated three remarkable gifts: a $60 million donation to support the new Master in Finance program at the Booth School of Business from alumni Clifford Asness and John Liu, a $75 million donation from the AbbVie Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to addressing health inequities, to support the construction of UChicago Medicine's new cancer pavilion, and a $100 million gift from an anonymous donor to support UChicago's leadership on the principles and practice of free expression. These accomplishments highlight the caliber of our community, one defined by curiosity and rigorous inquiry that comes together to debate and seek solutions to the issues of our time. This discussion on the new presidential administration and the anticipated impact on the economy is especially timely, and I am truly honored to introduce our speakers for the program. Randall Kroszner is the Norman R. Bobins Professor of Economics at the Booth School of Business. He previously served as governor of the Federal Reserve System from 2006 to 2009. Dr. Kroszner chaired the Committee on Supervision and Regulation of Banking Institutions and the Committee on Consumer and Community Affairs. He serves as the chair of the Financial Research Advisory Committee of the Office of Financial Research of the U.S. Treasury. His research interests include regulation of financial institutions, international financial crises, the Great Depression, monetary economics, corporate governance, debt restructuring and bankruptcy, and political economy. Joining Dr. Kroszner in the discussion is Hal Weitzman, Executive Director for Intellectual Capital and Adjunct Associate Professor of Behavioral Science at the Booth School of Business. He is the editor-in-chief of the Chicago Booth Review and host of the Chicago Booth Review podcast, a weekly series featuring Booth professors discussing their research. It is my pleasure to welcome Professors Kroszner and Weitzman. Thank you both so much for being here with us, and I'll now turn the virtual stage over to you.
Okay, all right, let's start. So Randy, we've had a lot of questions that came in ahead of this event. The largest single number of questions is about tariffs, and many of them connected to asking the question of whether tariffs will cause inflation. We had a question from Simon Viltz. How will the administration's tariff policies impact inflation? We had a question from Diego Gill. Are tariffs inflationary? One from Oleg Kucha, talking about the how tariffs will increase consumer prices and limit economic growth. Is that right? I mean, should we expect that we will have higher inflation because of tariffs?
What's interesting is there's a debate at the Fed right now about precisely this issue. Chris Waller, Federal Reserve Governor, today gave a talk and said, not really very worried about the inflationary impact of tariffs. It's a one-off. It's something that's not persistent. And the other view that Austin Goolsbee, who some of you may know, he was a former faculty member here at University of Chicago and is now head of the Chicago Fed. He says, no, he's really worried that it's going to lead to higher inflation down the line. So let's try to unpack that. So Austin's worried that it's going to be something that will be persistent, because that's what economists mean by inflation, not just a one-off, that a price goes up today and then stays at that higher level, That's not inflation, that's just a one-off. He's worried that there's going to be a trade war, that that the US introduces a tariff, another country introduces a higher tariff, we respond with a higher tariff, back and forth, and prices continue to move up. The alternative that Chris Waller has, and I'm much more sympathetic to what Chris has said, is that it's not persistent. Yes, certainly prices will go up for imports if you put a 25% tariff in on the imports, but it's just a one-off thing. It's not persistent. It's not going to lead to prices continuing to go up. And then you also have to think, well, what's the overall impact? How big is this? Well, the US, although a very big international trading partner, is not a country that has a lot of trade relative to the size of our economy. So if you look at exports, they're about 10%. If you look at imports, they're about 15%. So trade is about 25% of overall GDP. If you look at a country like Germany, it's 80%. If you look at Canada or Mexico, it's also very high. So it's much higher for other countries than for the US. So even if you were to put a tariff on the imports that come into the US, about 15% of total GDP, it doesn't have that much of an impact on the price level. There have been estimates done by the Congressional Budget Office as well as by the Boston Fed, and their estimates are depending on what level of tariffs there are, because of course there have been a lot of different proposals that are out there. But looking at something like the 25% on Mexico and Canada, and 60% on China, and then potentially more tariffs on others, it'll be about a half of 1%, maybe 3/4 of 1% higher price level, but not a persistent effect.
Okay, so first of all, what do you mean by persistent? What would persistent inflation be in terms of time frame?
So the estimates that like the Congressional Budget Office and the Boston Fed said it's basically 1 year. So if the tariffs go up now in 2025, by the end of the year, the price level will be a half to 3/4% higher than otherwise would be, but it'll just stay at that higher level. If you're worried about persistent inflation, let's say like what Austin Goolsbee has said, that you're going to get, well, we've got 25 now, and then it'll go to 30, and then it'll go to 40, higher and higher, then it may persist over time.
But is that based on the idea that we're just getting going with tariffs, as you and I know, is President Trump's favorite word, apparently?
Yes, he said it's one of the most beautiful words in the English language. And so we'll have to see whether it is just, there's a 25% that goes to 30 or 40, or as we have seen with some of the proposals that the president has made, he said 25, but maybe he'll pull it back. And so we just have to see how that will go. But I don't think it's going to lead to higher and higher levels of the tariffs and then trade war. It certainly could. I don't think Austin is crazy in suggesting that. But I think what Governor Chris Waller said today is more likely to be the case, that it's not going to be permanent. It certainly will raise the level in 2025, but not continue after that.
Okay, so we would expect higher inflation this year, in your view, but not the following year. But that depends on there not being a trade war. Is that right?
Yes, exactly. And that is important for Fed policy, because if it's something that's just a one-off, just happening this year, for example, Governor Waller, and I would agree with him, said, well, we would look through that. That is, it's not something that's persistent, so the Fed would not be responding with like higher interest rates to try to bring inflation down. If the concern is that that's going to be ongoing, sort of like what happened after COVID, when inflation went up from 2 to 3 to 4 all the way to 9%, then the Fed has to respond. But if it's just a one-off thing, not persistent, the Fed isn't going to respond, and I think it's much more likely to be just a one-off.
Okay. Well, Randy, given that we need to move on, I'm going to move on to another topic, which is Doge. And we had a lot of questions on Doge. That was probably the second most popular topic after tariffs. So, for example, from Nicholas Athanas, apologies if I said your name incorrectly, will Doge have any real effects on the economy? Wendy Fox asks, what impact can Doge have on government efficiency? So I guess two questions there. One is, will Doge really make a difference to government efficiency? And second, I know that a lot of people have looked with alarm at the way that Doge has proceeded, just disbanding government departments overnight, and then sometimes having to backtrack. I was reading today about people who have nuclear codes and are being called back to work because nobody knows how to operate those facilities. So what is your take on those in general?
So I think, so let's step back from the specifics of it. I think the idea of really trying to pare back unnecessary government spending, really think about it from kind of a zero-based budget. That's what a lot of people in the private sector do, rather than just say, oh, well, the Department of whatever spent $100 billion last year, so let's start with that as the base, and then how much more do you want to spend? Really ask the fundamental questions. Well, why is this department spending $100 billion? What are we getting for it? So I think asking those questions is very sensible. That's how private sector does budgeting. I think that would be valuable for making sure that the government is a good steward of taxpayers' money to see, well, is it really worth doing this? Now, that said, that can be disruptive. If you have to sort of explain everything once again every year and then try to describe why you should be having further expenditures. Obviously, DOGE can have an impact. We have seen that in quickly shutting down something like USAID, workers being laid off, then workers being brought back on, exactly as you were describing. So I wasn't sure that it would have any impact early on, but now we can see that clearly it can have an impact. I think in principle, the idea of it is something that makes sense. I think there's kind of a rough learning curve that's happening right now of, well, what can be done? Can this be done more slowly? Can this be done in a more deliberate way? Or is the only way to do it is just sort of say, okay, we're going to be cutting this much expenditure quickly, and then waiting for a response. Oh, well, you can't do that because of the nuclear codes. You can't do that because of this or that. That can be quite disruptive. I think a more sensible way to approach it would be to say, okay, here's why we're not sure that it makes sense to spend that $100 billion in this department. So you have X amount of time, a fairly short period of time, to respond and explain why it's worth $100 billion to the taxpayer, rather than just assume that it's worth $100 billion and don't ask those questions. But then if you don't get a good answer fairly quickly, then say, okay, well then we'll start paring back.
But I guess the question around is, do you think this is really going to have a significant impact on government budgets? I mean,
I think it can,
Yep.
for sure. I mean, we've already seen that there can be a substantial number of people who may not be employed anymore in the government, substantial cut in certain types of activities. So if if they propose things and can actually say, okay, we're just going to cut funding for that, and the courts agree with that, it can have quite an impact. Now, obviously, there's a lot of debate whether they have the legal ability to do that, and whether the executive branch has the ability to just say, well, Congress appropriated funding for something, but is not going to. But the president says, no, we shouldn't give that funding. That's a legal debate that will go on. I don't have an opinion on that, but I think in principle it can have an impact, and I think we've seen it.
Okay, and then I should have asked you when we talk about tariffs. I mean, there is a Department of External Revenue. Will there be much? I mean, will we actually make any money from tariffs?
So I think the president will. So some people have said, oh, well, it's just a negotiating ploy, that he's never really going to impose the tariffs. I don't think that's true, because I think the administration does realize that they need different sources of revenue. We'll get to taxes in a bit, but clearly the president has said he wants to continue the tax reductions and tax reforms from when he was president previously. And so he's got to get revenue from somewhere if he doesn't want the deficits debt and deficits to balloon. And the Department of External Funding, external revenue, would be one place for that. So I do think that there will be tariffs. I do think it will raise revenue. But as I said, you have to remember that imports are only about 15% of GDP. And so we're not going to be able to impose tariffs so high that they'd be a substantial amount of revenue that would offset the income tax or offset the corporate tax. But depending on what the president does, it will certainly help to provide an additional source of revenue to reduce debt and deficits.
Okay, so I mean, maybe some, maybe not very significant, but somewhat significant revenue there, and then maybe some savings from Doge. The go back to our original question about inflation, and you sort of said, well, there may well be, and that sounds like you're saying there will be inflation, just but it will be transitory. It opens up this another line of questioning which has come through, which you and I have talked about, which is about whether there's coherence here or whether it's just chaos. And there can appear to be chaos, particularly when you're closing down departments and then having to, find yourself in the courts or having to recalibrate and rehire people. Do you think you could describe the overall economic approach of this government? Because the other thing is that, there are things that it appears to be doing that are contradictory to other policies. So there doesn't appear to be a lot of internal coherence. Can you help us make sense of it?
Sure. So I always try to find the best possible explanation. So trying to give the benefit of the doubt. So you've got a number of things that the president said he's going to do. So one is try to reduce government expenditure and improve government efficiency. Second is to try to improve the business climate. So reduce corporate taxes to try to enhance investment. That's something that that a number of my colleagues or at least one of my colleagues at the Booth School of Business has done a nice analysis of the Trump tax reforms from when President Trump was in office previously, and suggested that the immediate expensing of expenditures on investment was actually very helpful in generating more investment. Because if you compare the U.S. to other countries post-COVID, we've had a much stronger investment climate, and that seems to be something that has been very helpful. If you have more investment, you're then going to have more productivity because you have more better machines, better software, more things for people to work with, and productivity is the output per hour that people have. So if you have AI that is helping you, if you have laptops that are working better than my laptop that are helping you, then you can be more productive, and that leads to higher wages as well as higher economic activity, overall economic growth. Because ultimately, economic growth is the number of hours worked times the output per hour, the productivity. And so if you can have the government be more efficient and less burdensome, if you can have the tax system incentivize investment, if you can have other sources of revenue like from the tariffs to make sure that debt and deficits don't get too high, you can put these pieces together and generate a positive economic growth. Now, some of the challenges there are tariffs have good and bad aspects to them. They may be useful bargaining tools to try to get to other ends. As I mentioned, the U.S. is much less dependent upon trade than other countries. So if you're trying to get to another end, let's say dealing with fentanyl or dealing with immigration issues, you may be able to use that as a bargaining chip, because although it may have some impact on making certain types of imports more expensive, for example, low cost clothing coming in from emerging market countries, if you slap a 25% tariff on that then makes it more expensive for people to buy clothes. But if that gets if it achieves another objective, then you can debate, is it worth doing it in that way if you otherwise couldn't achieve that objective? For example, trying to slow fentanyl coming across the borders, or to have better control over the immigration process. There's also the issue of immigration, and certainly if you were to tighten the borders and to have the number of people in the U.S. job market shrink through deportations, all other things being equal, that means that you'll have a tighter labor market and more wage pressure. Now, President Trump and his advisors argue, well, that's the combination of making sure that we only have legal workers in the U.S. and we have tariffs that help to develop certain industries that potentially can generate jobs in those areas. That's a very controversial, very, very controversial issue. When the president introduced steel tariffs back in the previous administration, there was very little impact on overall economic activity or on prices. It may be quite different this time. So you can kind of see how in with the president and his advisors, how you can put the pieces together to try to tell a story about trying to generate more economic growth, more productivity, more investment in the U.S., more activity in the U.S. But obviously there are challenges that could make it more difficult to achieve all of that using all the levers that the president has talked about.
Okay, all right. Thank you for trying to help us make sense of it there, Randy. You raised several issues which we're going to touch on quickly. I see the clock ticking. Let's talk about tax cuts. We had a couple of questions come in from Elizabeth Fromkin asks, could you address projected tax cuts and possible effects on the US economy? And of course, the original tax cuts that you talked about there, you mentioned that they, well, actually, when you were away, Randy, when you were trying to reconnect, we talked about Eric Zwick's research on tax cuts and how you're right that he did find that they encouraged investment, although they did not pay for themselves. I think that's sort of a key point to make. But those tax cuts from 2017 are coming up for renewal. Presumably, there's a good chance that they will be renewed, and that will add to the deficit. So what are your expectations about tax cuts? What effect will those tax cuts have on the US economy? Also, that President Trump has said he wants to lower corporate rates even further. Will that actually work to spur much more investment?
Well, what's interesting is that the U.S. hadn't really changed its overall corporate tax rate for quite some time, but the rest of the world brought it down a lot. And so certainly we're in a globally competitive environment. Firms are deciding where they're going to put their headquarters, where they're going to put their operations. And so we have to think about the context, the global context in which we're operating. And so we did reduce corporate taxes, the corporate tax rates in the first Trump administration, but other countries have responded. And it's interesting, there was just a report in the Financial Times recently about New Zealand, which always had very low corporate taxes, saying, well, we have to lower them again because the rest of the world has brought them down. So I do think that we have to think about how we can maintain our globally competitive stance, and so that may mean bringing corporate taxes down so that we're in the same relative position that we were in a number of years ago. As you've mentioned, and as I mentioned, Eric Zwick's work shows that if you have the immediate expense of investment, that can be a very good incentive for investment. And I think that's been helpful in driving investment growth in the U.S. more than we see in other countries. And so those are the positives. On the negatives, it depends what happens to revenue. So if you lose a lot of revenue and debt and deficits go up, then you have to worry about what happens to interest rates. The Fed has a lot of influence over the short rate, but if it turns out that there's a lot of government borrowing that's going on, as well as a lot of private sector borrowing, because a lot of people are now very excited about AI and there's a lot of investment there. Think back to just sort of simple supply and demand, great University of Chicago type of analysis. All the things being equal, if demand is going up for borrowing, price is going to go up. That is, interest rates are going to go up, be more costly to borrow. And so I think that is going to be one of the disciplining factors, or should be a disciplining factor, and I think will be a disciplining factor. And I think that's one of the reasons why the administration doesn't want the debt and deficit to go up too much, because otherwise it'll start to become very expensive to finance that. It'll also become more expensive for the private sector to do its investment, which will be a discouragement, even if you have lower taxes. If ultimately you think about the cost of investing is going to be your tax rate, the cost of capital, which and where interest will play an important role in that. So you want to make sure that you don't inadvertently, by bringing down the tax rate, actually increase the ultimate cost of capital, the after-tax cost of capital, because you've raised interest rates so much because people are concerned about debt and deficits.
Randy, if tax cuts didn't pay for themselves last time, will they do so this time? And if they won't, then is it irresponsible to enact further tax cuts?
Well, again, it depends what you think about what your goals are. If it can help to achieve greater economic growth, greater productivity growth, even if it doesn't necessarily immediately pay for itself in the short run, it could be good for overall welfare of people in the U.S. And so I don't think you want to just look at it just, does it pay for itself? I think what is the impact on welfare of U.S. citizens, and higher productivity growth, more investment, higher wage growth could be benefits that aren't necessarily reflected in revenue to the Treasury Department, could be reflected in overall economic welfare.
Okay, let's talk about regulation. Every government talks about slashing regulation. Few actually ever achieve that, and most tend to add to regulation, or there's some performative thing where they say they're going to get rid of regulation and they really don't. Do you think that that is possible this time to actually meaningfully reduce regulation? And if so, what regulation would you like to see reduced?
So I think it's still early on to see. I mean, there have been discussions of removing one regulation for every 10 regulations or something like that. It's very hard to know what as we economists say, the unit of analysis is, or the unit of measurement. What is a regulation? Is that one line in the federal code? Is it a statute that has been passed by Congress? There's a lot of uncertainty about exactly what that means. So I think it's not best to think about it in terms of, one in regulation for 10. It's really, what is the impact on the incentives for innovation, the incentives for entrepreneurs, the incentives for people to work. That's really I think the key things to be thinking about. And so, as I was saying before, all other things being equal, you reduce the tax rates, you increase if they're income tax rates, you increase the incentive for work. If they're corporate tax rates or investment, they reduce the cost, and so increase the incentive for investment, which, as I said, could be a positive thing for overall economic growth. And so I think that's part of the rationale for pursuing those approaches. Same thing with regulation. You can think of that as that's an additional cost of doing business. And so if you reduce the costs of doing business and allow people to take more risks and be more entrepreneurial, that has potential upside. Now, of course, if you take away too many of the guardrails, then there are more risks that are being taken. Well, you can't really have innovation without having some risks. And so the key is getting that trade-off right of, you may want to peel back regulation in some areas. So let's take one area like financial regulation, which the administration has talked about. I'm not really sure about some of the other areas, but I think they've talked about regulatory consolidation in banking and financial services, because many financial institutions have multiple regulators that they have to respond to, and so potentially streamlining that, because that also gets back to DOGE, making the government more efficient, so that a bank or a financial institution would just deal with one regulator rather than with two or three regulators, deal with one set of regulations rather than two or three overlapping set of regulations. And then think about, well, where do we get the trade-offs right? Certainly, we want to avoid financial crises, so we want to make sure that there are guardrails there, that you don't take too much risk, or there's not too much of incentive for risk. But you want to have incentives for people, taking some risks. We've raised capital requirements on banks dramatically over since the global financial crisis, and that's been very important. And I think that's made the financial system much safer. We didn't have a financial crisis after COVID, and I think that's a testament to some of the improvements that we've had in financial regulation. That said, I think we have to go back and look in a good cost benefit way. Well, there's some areas where we've gone too far. Have we raised the capital costs so high that banks aren't really providing a lot of funding? One area of that is in housing. It used to be that banks were the major providers of mortgages. Now it's outside of the banking system is where the majority of mortgages are originated. And so we have to think about, well, does that make sense? Is that the right risk allocation and right allocation of funding of banks, for them to use it for other purposes or to hold it as capital rather than being using for producing mortgages? So that's the kind of trade-offs that are there. I think it definitely is worthwhile to be having a new look at financial regulation, thinking about streamlining there, reducing the number of regulators and overlapping regulation that banks face. But that said, we still want to be very concerned about systemic risk.
I mean, one of the hallmarks of the Biden administration was an FTC, Federal Trade Commission, that was extremely vigilant about M&A, and was many deals didn't happen because Lena Khan, the head of the FTC, was particularly vigilant about concentration of market power, which is something that a lot of economists have been concerned about. Do you expect that we'll now go in the opposite direction? There'll be a big wave of M&A and a consolidation, a concentration of market power.
Well, what's interesting is if you may recall that J.D. Vance on a couple of occasions, when asked, would he keep anyone from the Biden administration, he said, well, I might keep Lena Khan. And the reason for that is she was very concerned, exactly as you said, particularly in the area of technology, of so-called big tech, and making it very difficult for entrepreneurial and new players to come in. And the recent Google antitrust case that the Justice Department won was actually started at the end of the Trump administration. So although people say, oh, well, Trump has a completely different view of antitrust and a completely different view of the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice antitrust approach, that's not actually true. Because, as I said, J.D. Vance called out Lena Khan as someone who he had a lot of intellectual connection with, and was very sympathetic to the approaches that she was taking, at least with respect to big tech. And the Google antitrust case that was just won was, the arguments were made and the ideas were started. Well, I mean, the suit and the ideas in it were started under Trump. So under the original Trump administration. So I think it's going to be mixed. I think you're going to see still a deep wariness of much of big tech, much along the lines of the Google antitrust suit and some of what Lena Khan had done. But I think in other areas, you're not going to see as much wariness. And so I think there'll be other areas where you don't have that level of concentration, where I think the FTC and under Trump would say, let's allow for more mergers. Let's allow for more things to come through. But I think there'll be real wariness for big tech.
Okay, let's move on. A lot of questions came in, Randy, about immigration. Julie Branfield asks, what do you see as the impact of deporting immigrant workforce? Don May says, what will tariffs and mass deportation do to the US economy? We had a question just come in now from, one second, it's from Keith Osher. What's likely to be the impact of Trump's immigration policy on inflation? You touched on that earlier. And one specific one from Scott Parson, what's the likely impact of mass deportations on the construction sector? So can you talk about what you expect if there were mass deportations? I mean, we've had some deportations. If it continues or grows at a pace, what would be the effect on the economy?
Sure, I'll focus on the immigration issue since I touched on some of the tariff issues from before. Yeah, so it obviously, as I mentioned earlier, if you have fewer workers in the U.S., all the things being equal, that's going to mean a tighter labor market and more wage pressure. And then the question is, are there certain types of jobs that immigrants are doing that if you were to have a large-scale deportation, that it'd be difficult to find domestic workers to be able to pursue? One of the areas that people often talk about is, well, one area is related to food and to harvesting of different types of crops. Another one is in the construction sector. So certainly, if there is a very large, quick deportation of people who are in these sectors, and there's nobody else who's coming in to replace them, that means there are fewer workers. Prices of those workers are going to go up. That is, wages are going to go up, and it'll be much tighter and more costly there. Now the question is, what is going to be the scale of this, and how quickly will this occur? I think it's going to be very difficult to have a truly mass set of deportations. precisely because the workers are undocumented, it's hard to find them. It's not like there's just sort of this simple list where you go and say, okay, here are the 200,000 people who don't have the documentation, and now you must leave. It takes a lot of effort to do that, and will take time. So I think that it will be something that'll have an impact over a horizon of a year to 2 years, rather than just be something right now.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I was just trying to unmute myself. All right, let's move on because we have so many topics to talk about, Randy. And I wanted to ask you, you touched on this earlier about the deficit. So, look, we had various questions come in about, this is probably one that captures it the best from John Bloom. He's an economics graduate, so he's captured it very nicely. A succinct question: is the U.S. economy at risk for a sovereign debt crisis? He says.
Oh, big question. So I don't think in the near term, but I do think we have to worry in the longer term. As I mentioned, if you got basic supply and demand, if there's a very big increase in the demand for borrowing from the government, as well as a lot of incentives for investment, and now just overall a lot of enthusiasm for investing in things related to artificial intelligence, those NVIDIA chips, and so many other things. The demand for borrowing is quite strong in the U.S., and especially if you get a substantial increase in the amount of deficit spending that is required to finance the government activities, then you're going to be pushing out the demand curve, and interest rates are going to start to move up. The question for a sovereign debt crisis will be: does the U.S. have the wherewithal to be able to repay? Now, there are lots of debates about these kinds of things. Is there sort of a magic number that once you get to 90% or 100%, there'd been some research a few years ago that said sort of 95% was the magic number, and you get into a debt crisis after that. Well, we certainly passed by that, and a number of European countries have passed by that without a debt crisis. So I don't think that there is a magic number. You can look to Japan, for example, which has debt on the order of, depending exactly how you want to measure it, 250% to 300% of GDP, so dramatically higher than the U.S., 2 to 3 times what the U.S. has. And obviously, they have not had a debt crisis. They borrow at low interest rates. Now, their interest rates have been going up, and part of that is because of some of the changes at the central bank, but also part of it is this concerns about there's so much borrowing that lenders want to get a little more compensation for doing all that lending. So I don't think that we're on the verge of a sovereign debt crisis, but we should be wary about the costs. And we don't want to get into a situation where some countries have gotten into that an enormous fraction of their total government expenditures go for interest payments. That's not a very good use of taxpayers' money. And so I think we do have to be careful about that. And this then gets back to the ideas behind, the good principles behind government efficiency and streamlining, that if we can reduce some of those burdens, we don't have to spend as much, but we can get just as much in terms of what the government does, the services the government provides.
But I mean, we have a Congress that's asking to, as part of its budget, to raise the debt ceiling. I mean, surely you don't expect that at the end of these 4 years we'll have a smaller deficit.
Well, the question is, the interesting part is relative to GDP. So just as economy grows over time, and we do have inflation, all these numbers are going to grow over time. So it's really, when you think about it as the ability to repay, it's like relative to the size of the economy. And so at least the plans that we have seen from the administration so far suggest that we're not going to be reducing the amount of debt relative to GDP, but we still have to see exactly what they're going to do. There's a lot of uncertainty about what the DOGE will do, whether there will be really substantial cuts in expenditure, and we have to see what the economy does. Will some of the regulatory changes and investment incentives help to spur economic growth that, although won't pay for themselves, as we were talking about before, help to reduce some of those gaps.
Okay, we must move on. And you talked about uncertainty, so let's talk about that. We got quite lots of questions on this. One from Linda Saris, who's UChicago MBA. Linda says, business hates uncertainty, and that's all we get with this administration. You can't make important investment decisions when this administration makes rash and uninformed decisions that are at times so ill-advised they get rescinded or challenged. And then Robert Milstein says, how much might uncertainty slow the economy? If manufacturers and retailers hold larger inventories, they might otherwise inventory turns diminish. Will this greatly impact growth and earnings? I mean, I'm just interested generally, how can we expect companies to invest if, at least at the first month or so, we've had quite a lot of uncertainty, quite a lot of policies that are announced and then immediately reversed?
So we saw a lot of enthusiasm after the election. We saw, markets go up very significantly in expectation that there would be regulatory change, there'd be a much more business-friendly environment. We would see potentially some financial regulatory burdens being reduced, and all of that reducing cost of capital, making it easier for the U.S. economy to grow. So we had a lot of enthusiasm, and now we're hitting some headwinds. Exactly as you said, uncertainty is certainly not investment's friend. And I think the administration is trying to figure out, well, what can it get done? It wants to get a lot done in a very short period of time. The midterm elections are only 2 years away. It tends to be, whether it's Republican administration or Democratic administration, that there's usually a swing against the president's party in the midterm elections. So, in some sense, the president doesn't have a lot of time to do things. And so I think he's trying to see, well, what sorts of things potentially can be done. Obviously, some of them are going to be facing legal challenges, and then he'll move ahead with the things that can be done. I think if we're still seeing this uncertainty 6 months from now, that's going to be a very big burden on the private sector and make it very difficult for investors to move forward. I think if it's, the administration kind of, getting its sea legs and figuring out what priorities it has and what it can actually get through, if that's, a month or two, I think the markets will be able to deal with that. We've kind of seen that in the stock market. So the stock market had zoomed up after the election, has come down a bit, but is now sort of floating around somewhat flat, I think waiting to see whether we'll get some signal out of all the different, a lot of the noise that has come out over the last month.
Okay, well, I'm glad you raised that, because one of the big things that drives the stock market is interest rates. And of course, you were at the Fed yourself, and you mentioned one of your colleagues is now, Austin Goolsbee, is now at the Fed. The Fed had been saying, that it was going to cut, well, it's still expected officially to cut rates twice this year. But, a lot of questions about when that will happen. There's some of the questions that came in. Stephen Eliscu, another Chicago MBA, how do you expect Fed to react to Trump administration actions? Kiba Mbaye asks, will the Fed maintain or reduce interest rates? How confident are you, Randy, that the Fed is going to stick to that plan of 2 cuts this year?
So I think they're not sure it's going to be 2 cuts or not. And as I mentioned earlier on, there's a debate among people at the Fed, not only over tariffs, as I had described before, of some people thinking, like Austin, think that's going to be driving inflation up. So they're going to be worried about inflation moving up substantially from where we are, versus someone like Chris Waller, who's one of the governors, said, no, I think that's not going to be permanent. That's just sort of a one-off thing, and that he would look through that. And he said he's still expecting 1-2 interest rate cuts for the year. So what's going to happen? Well, part of it is we have to see what some of these policies will be. Will there be trade wars, or will this be kind of a one-off type of thing? Will the president get through some of the tax cuts that will generate more investment and more economic activity? Where will longer-term interest rates go? So I think a lot of people had been thinking, oh, well, when the Fed cuts interest rates, those long rates are going to come down, mortgages are going to come down, some of the problems in the commercial real estate sector, oh, well, they'll be saved by interest rates coming down. And I don't think that's going to be the case. because the short rate is coming down. That's what the Fed has the direct control over. But that longer term rate, the 10-year rate, off of which mortgages, 30-year mortgages are priced, and a lot of other long-term borrowing in the economy is priced off of that. It goes back to fundamental supply and demand factors that are there. And we saw a period of extraordinarily low interest rates for a long period of time over the last 15 years. Now interest rates are getting back more into the territory of where they had been historically. And I think we're more likely to get into that area. Now, why do I think that? Well, it gets back to some of these supply and demand factors. Now, why were interest rates so unusually low for the last really 30 years? We've seen interest rates come down a lot. And so I did some research with some colleagues, someone who formerly had been at Booth, and as well as some other former central bank governors. And what we found is that the thing that fit with that long-term decline in interest rates was that that was when China was being integrated into the global economy. And China is a very, very high savings country. Savings rates in the order of 40%. And so you had, for many years, until let's say over the last few years, you had China growing at 10 to 15% real, with more than 1 billion people, and a 40% savings rate. So you saw China build its sovereign wealth fund from basically nothing to $4 trillion over that period. That was evidence of that incredible increase in supply of savings. So all other things being equal, if the supply is shifting out, price is going to go down. So interest rates went down. Well, we now know that China is aging very rapidly. The working age population is shrinking. One of the co-authors on this paper was from Japan, and so it turns out that China is going to age more rapidly than Japan did. Now, you may remember the old debates. Oh, well, Japan was a very high savings economy. That's because Japanese just are different. They like to save more. I really dislike explanations that people are different. I think people face different constraints. So it was true that Japan used to be very high saving, but today their savings rate is lower than the US savings rate. That's not because the character of the Japanese economy changed. It's because you had a dramatic change in demographics, very rapid aging of the population. The US is also aging, and China, as I said, is going to age more rapidly. Well, savings rates come down almost mechanically when you have more old people relative to young people, because savings rates are the difference between how much you're pulling out of your savings to consume versus what your income is. And so if you have more retired people, you're going to have more people pulling out of savings, fewer savings, less resources being provided. Again, all other things being equal, if that supply curve is shifting, interest rates are going to go up. Will they go up as high as they were 30 years ago? I don't think so, because China is still a very high savings economy, not growing nearly as fast, savings rate not quite as high as it was. So it'll still be contributing savings. So I think these interest rates, these longer term rates, stay higher.
Okay, Randy, unfortunately, this has been fascinating, but unfortunately, I think our time is up. I want to thank everyone who sent in fantastic questions, both
Great
beforehand
questions.
and during this. This is a very sharp bunch, and I know that some people will be listening and with their head in their hands, and others will be listening and nodding along and agreeing with everything you say. But for the moment, Randy, thank you very much. Let's hand it back to Lauren.
Yes, thank you, Randy and Hal, both for a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much to our audience for joining us, for putting up with some technical difficulties, and most of all, for your amazing questions. I have to tell you, we received more than 200 questions during the session to add to the more than 400 questions that were submitted prior to the session. So unsurprisingly, you all are a very University of Chicago bunch. And I just want to name, I saw questions from parents, I saw questions from college alumni, lab alumni, Booth alumni, PhD alumni, MBA. I saw someone from France, I think, in the Q&A at some point. So it's such a great representation of the breadth of our community of alumni and friends and parents who've joined us today. And I just want to thank you all so much. I hope you're leaving as excited to continue to engage with the university as I am. There's so many ways you can do so. You can join us for another event. You can volunteer. You can provide philanthropic support for faculty and students. You can spread the word about the groundbreaking work and scholarship happening at the university. You can pop over to the Chicago Booth Review podcast and check out more of this amazing work. But most importantly, I just want to again thank you, Hal and Randy, and thank all of you for coming together with our University of Chicago community today. Enjoy the rest of your week.